Good afternoon. Welcome to our presentation this afternoon, English Language Learners in an MTSS Framework, Culturally Responsive Practices and its Impact on the Linguistic, Academic, Social, and Emotional Development of English Learners. We're presenting today from our Harrisburg office of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. My name is Amy Smith, and I'm an educational consultant for Patton in our office in Malvern, and past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. Our presentation today is the third and final webinar in a series of 3, all topics related to working with students that are English learners. Our first presentation, offered on September 27th, addressed federal and state policies, procedures, and resources regarding the education of English learners. The second presentation, offered last Thursday on October 4th, covered what school psychologists and school counselors need to know about progress monitoring and language instruction and educational program effectiveness. And finally, our third webinar today will address culturally responsive practices and its impact on the linguistic, academic, social, and emotional development of English learners. All 3 of these webinars are being recorded and archived. These recordings and their accompanying training materials will be available to review or use at your convenience. You'll be able to find them on the Patton website, www.patton.net. They'll be available in the near future. If you or any of your colleagues haven't been able to attend during the scheduled time, or if you'd like to review and share these presentations with others, you'll be able to do that. Providing services to students with cultural and language differences presents specific challenges to school psychologists and school counselors. These 3 webinars provide you with tools and guidance in laws and regulations related to English learners, instruction and progress monitoring of English learners, and implementing culturally responsive practices that will benefit all students. Working with students that are English learners and their families is a constantly evolving field, and we're pleased to offer continuing professional development in this area. Throughout our presentation today, you'll be able to ask questions or ask for clarification by using the chat box feature. We'll do our best to address questions as they come in. If you have questions following the presentation, on the last slide, you'll see an email address that's provided for you. Simply send in your questions to that email address. They'll be forwarded to our presenters, who will answer and respond to you. Let me introduce the team that developed and presented these 3 webinars. They function as consultants for the Patton office and work across the state on this topic. We have Ana Sanz de la Peña. We have Francine Dutrasac and Paula Zucker. And today we'll have Ana and Paula presenting for us. So without further delay, let me turn today's webinar over to Ana.
Thank you, Amy. And we also have to say thank you to Amy Smith. And Dr. Smith has been with us throughout, since we started to work on this in July, actually. We had our first meeting. And her expertise in reviewing our content has been really appreciated. So we're going to start today with our webinar, really looking at that component of culturally responsive practices. And with that, we are going to go deeper into the area of how can we actually use all of these practices with students who are diverse. The Patton mission, the mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. Our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program. Teams begin with a general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Don't forget, if you want Act 48, you have to contact Marcy Davis. Her email is there. If you are actually, watching or really going through the webinar with 2 or 3 people and using just one computer. She needs to know that the names of the participants doing that. You also need to complete the SurveyMonkey. We will provide you with access to that survey at the end of this webinar. And again, a little reminder again of Act 48. Don't forget to complete the SurveyMonkey, and we have specific dates when the SurveyMonkey is open. We have 2 outcomes that we would like to achieve once you have actually participated in the webinar. We're going to analyze evidence-based practices related to developing and strengthening culturally responsive school environments for diverse students and their families. And that is so important that now we are also looking at family engagement from the perspective of providing bridges to families who are, who definitely need those special supports to be active members of our school community. We're going to examine the acculturation process of English learners and their families as an integral part of establishing a culturally responsive environment within the multi-tier system of support framework. With that said, we are looking at culturally responsive systems. And when we talk about a system, we know that our educational system is actually made up of 3 components. First is people, then is policies and practices. When we talk about people, we are referring at all the actors in this sort of system. And they are teachers, parents, administrators, school boards, and the community. So the people that are part of the system usually need to follow specific policies in order to have practices that will influence and make our system more effective. So when we have policies, it is our responsibility as administrators, teachers, and all other educators to know these policies, so we have to align our practices to those policies. If we do that, we will create really an environment that is going to be equitable and that is going to respect the culture of all the people who are part of that system. So what we say literally, and research tells us, is that a culturally responsive educational system is grounded on the belief that we need to build systems that are responsive to cultural differences. And we are always looking to include rather than exclude the members of all of these cultures and all of these different areas that they come to us. We definitely know that in order for us to achieve that culturally and linguistically support for our students, we need to value the culture that they bring. And they are, capable learners, and they could be definitely an asset in our system. So we need to facilitate that interrelationship that we have with all of our students. One piece that is so important about multi-tier systems of support, the framework that we have in Pennsylvania, is that it promotes that culturally responsive approach. Because when we look at multi-tier systems of support, we're actually looking at providing different supports to students from the perspective of a system. And when we look at culturally responsive systems, we are also looking at the same goal from that perspective of including all students rather than excluding students or parents. We also look at problem solving and the use of data, which is also very important in a culturally responsive educational system, because data is going to actually help us to really know who are these members of our school community and what do they need in order to be successful. And there goes the problem solving process by which all of us will sit at the table and try to provide the different avenues for these students to be successful. The communication and collaboration part is important, and also the capacity of building that infrastructure within our systems to provide access to all students to be successful students. And that also calls for that leadership component of MTSS. The good thing about MTSS is that we are not looking at what the student really lacks or what is happening with just the student. What we are doing in MTSS is looking at the system, because when there are many students who are not really achieving those standards, that means that we need to go back and look at how we are instructing, how are we teaching in these environments, because we are supposed to be doing everything possible in our instruction to achieve or to help students achieve those standards, right? So instead of asking what is wrong with the student, we need to also, be more ample in the way that we measure what is going on and look at our system to see what is happening in our system that we see that students are not reaching those standards. So our strong alignment with MTSS when we talk about culturally responsive systems is that definitely in order to be culturally responsive, you should be looking not only at the academic performance of your students, but also the behavioral systems. How are you supporting students who are experiencing some sort of disconnect with your school or with the classroom experience? So they are misbehaving or they are doing things that are not what you expect them to really do in relation to behavior. So the behavior component of MTSS actually calls also for looking at students from a different perspective that could be their cultural, innuendos and their cultural, the culture that they bring to the school. It might be there could be misunderstandings about that. The same way in the academic side of MTSS, what we're doing is actually including every student in the process of teaching and learning by providing the required interventions that are designed to help students, not just to put them in different categories, but how are we helping these students to have a more dynamic way of moving through those tiers. It is essential, and this is a quote that we have, that school psychologists remember the exclusionary clause of LD, which states that the learning problems experienced by students cannot be the primarily the result of environmental, cultural, economic disadvantage. So when we look at the students that have been referred to us for evaluation, we need to look at this. We need to be very sure that maybe, what the student is experiencing is a language barrier that might have, some performances that can mirror some of these disabilities. But going through that process of acquiring a new language is not a disability. Therefore, you need to weed that out before you really jump into the idea of evaluation. So it says whenever assessing for learning disabilities, you also need, to pay a lot of attention to, the area of language acquisition. That is so important to understand and to have enough background information in how these students are supported through programs that you may have in your schools. So that is why when we presented our webinars, we spent some time in webinar 2 to give you the power of knowledge about, so how do we implement really the programs that help students acquire English as a second language? The learning difficulties cannot be caused or explained by environmental variables, including second language acquisition. That's another quote from Barrera, 2006. And again, we need to go back. In order for us to understand second language acquisition, we also need to understand from the perspective of counselors and school counselors and school psychologists, the areas where, second language acquisition really can be confused or misunderstood. And we cannot actually jump to those conclusions without looking at the whole ecology of the child. Remember that not all ELs are the same. Not all ELs come with the same skills or the same life experience. We can have students that are, refugees who have had interrupted education when they lived in those refugee camps. We may have students who come from, agricultural societies in which going to school was not the most important thing that children did. So we need to know more than just what level of English language development this child is. So that's why we would like for you to feel empowered to ask questions. And we have provided some of those questions in webinar 2 and webinar 3. There are 3 types of problems that English learners may be facing. The first problem is definitely that the environment in which they are is not that effective for these children to have opportunities to learn. And you will be able to actually find that because you will see that in some school settings, there are problems with, all children or with most children. And the problems become even worse when students who come from a different language background do not receive the appropriate support and do not get the appropriate instruction. So that part that says inappropriate teaching learning environments is very important for us to consider. So that's, the type of problem 1. We know that in some instances, children who are ELs are pulled out and there is not a classroom for them. I have seen in some schools that they are learning like in the hallway or under the steps of a stairway. I have seen teachers with little desks and 5 students in the steps teaching their children. I mean, is that the most appropriate environment for these children to learn? So when the gap is there, let's look at what is happening with these children when they are receiving that instruction. Type 2 problems arise when students' academic problems become worse over time because instructional approaches never meet the child's educational needs. We see that with students who have been in the ELD or ESL program for many years, more than 5 years. Children enter the program maybe in 1st grade, and they are in 10th grade or 11th grade, and they are still in the program. So what does that tell me? Number 1, that there's not a strong way to actually look at the scores of these children, every year, so they're falling through the cracks. But it is also the ineffective way that they are taught that makes, students not being able to exit the program. And why is that? Because their literacy skills haven't been really, at the level where they need to be. And that is the case for many of the students who we call, the long-term English learners. And we have many of them in many of our school systems. Type 3 problems, students have educational needs that must be met by special education since they have a disability, and their needs cannot be addressed by general education alone. So when the student really has a disability and is getting special education services, let's not forget also of their language development. So the whole idea of having students already in special education does not mean that their ELD program, the English Language Acquisition program, needs to stop. On the other hand, it needs to go hand in hand so the students move ahead with a strong foundation in English. Now, Echevarria in 2008 really looked at some, students that had a learning disability and also were ELs. And this is what she tells us, that ELs with LD tend to have language patterns that are distinct from others in their cultural and ethnic community. So that is definitely a way to really look at comparing, that student with peers, with other students who are ELs. So you understand that their patterns really are, the language patterns are different. They are distinct. They are not the same. They also tend to have limited vocabulary in both languages, in their native language and in the second language. And they demonstrate deficits in receptive and expressive language. So if students have been in this country for less than 3 years, and there is still, that language spoken at home and in their communities, then you can start measuring that by interviewing parents. How is, how is does the student functioning or communicating in their first language? Or you can also start, looking at those tests who are in English and in Spanish or in any other languages and look at that vocabulary. And in addition, they often struggle with understanding non-verbal language. That is so important. So here you have like 3 different ways of looking at students that ELs who have a disability. They really struggle with understanding nonverbal language. That's one. They also have very limited vocabulary in L1 and L2, and definitely have different language patterns or distinct patterns from other students who are ELs. With that, I finish my part, and now Paula is going to take a look at the culture and some of the cultural similarities and differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. So here we see the cultural iceberg. And when we look at this cultural iceberg, we notice that the surface culture elements are easily viewed and easily understood by us. They're rather overt elements. The elements within the deep culture, however, are not as easily perceived. So how do these elements affect the learning process? It is very important for us to develop an understanding of the values and cultural elements that our ELs bring with them to their new environment. It is equally important to enlighten the ELs and their families of the new norms and behavioral elements that will influence their progress in their new community. So we look at the surface culture as, for example, greetings that may be different in 2 different cultures: money, clothing, family, social activities. But when we look at the deep culture, we need to make an effort to understand what are the differences between power distance, between degrees of individualism, degrees of masculinity. What are the values in the culture that is new to American culture? What are the differences? Time orientation. Why does it seem that some of our students come late to certain events or even to class? Many of these are very important, all of these actually, for us to understand. We need to understand our students' communication styles, and they need to understand ours, social norms and values, especially expectations of the school, the roles of the teacher, the parent, the student, writing styles as well. So all of this is so important to understand. The basic individualistic and collectivistic views of people as either independent or interdependent lead to contrasting sets of values. So if we look at the world today, nearly 3/4 of the world's cultures can be described as collectivistic. Culturally and linguistically diverse groups generally fall uh, into the collectivistic end, although American culture displays more individualistic values. So right there, we can see a total difference in norms, a difference in values. And it is imperative that we as educators realize these differences and focus on these. When we determine the ecology of our students, it's important to consider these contrasts in emphasis between common collectivistic and individualistic values. So here you can see the continuum of values and the differences between collectivistic and individualistic. Remember, American values are on the individualistic side. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are here for your interest, I hope, and your perusal. Their values influence their behavior and performance in the school setting. It is of great importance that we as educators understand these values as we make decisions regarding the instruction of these students. So before we decide to refer an English learner for possible disability testing, we must consider the cultural influences. Here you can see some aspects of deep culture, as mentioned earlier. We need to see the differences between eye contact that's made with our new students. Do they look at us straight ahead or do they look down? What is their social distance? What are gender expectations? I've heard teachers who are worried about the interactions between themselves, if they're female educators, and perhaps their male students who seem to behave in a different way toward their female teachers. Well, this can all be based upon cultural norms from the home country. Time orientation, expectations of school roles. What does that look like in the student's native country? And why does it look as though there could be a behavioral issue and an issue that needs discipline in the new setting? In an MTSS framework, it is imperative that we focus on the ecologies of our English learners. Even though all of our ELLs have limited English proficiency and all must reach the same content standards, our ELLs are far from being a monolithic group. So here are some examples of the diversity of our English learners. As Anna mentioned earlier, and we mentioned in previous parts of this webinar, there are long-term ELLs. Those students who remain in the LIEP for longer than 5 years. There are migrant ELLs, refugees. We have to consider the distance, the language distance between the first language and English. Perhaps there is a totally different alphabetic system. The phonology may be totally different and probably is. There's so many differences that could be prevalent in this diverse group of English learners. There are ELLs with IEPs, whether it's gifted or disabilities. There are highly schooled ELLs. There are ELLs, and many ELLs, born in the United States. With this in mind, we must examine these characteristics that may aid or impede second language acquisition. Looking here, we are focusing on refugees and asylees. Refugees and asylees leave their countries because of war or persecution, which is due to their nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a group. So they don't choose to come here just to take a trip and find out how wonderful life is in America. They are leaving under possibly very difficult circumstances, which can affect their future learning. Do we know what emotions our students have experienced that may be causing certain behaviors in the classroom? So during their escape, refugees may experience panic, shock, fear, danger, hunger, fatigue, separation, fear of victimization, fear of being detected or caught in the crossfire. These are very serious, serious feelings that they may have experienced. Feelings and experiences that will certainly impact their future learning. Have our students been in a refugee camp? The refugee camp experience is characterized by possibly all or many of these characteristics. I'm not going to read them all to you, but it's important that we develop an understanding of these characteristics. When refugees are resettled, they may face the fact of never going home, the loss of family and friends, loss of familiar culture, anxiety over discrimination in their new country or in their host country, concern over cultural adaptation, concern for economic survival, daily survival issues, language barriers. How do these feelings impact learning and your counseling strategies. Refugee students are often scared and confused when they first attend school. Until students adjust, they will have difficulty to understand and respond to academic information. But their adaptation is often surprisingly swift. As refugee students become comfortable, they have a better chance of learning. When I was teaching in Philadelphia many years ago, and I received refugee students in my classroom, I found that I became my students and their families' first friend. And we owe that to our students to be accessible to them as they have to go through their changes. Keep in mind that some refugee students are experiencing these following experiences for the first time. The freedom to express opinions in public. So how does that look in our classrooms? Are they going to be sitting there raising their hand, trying to answer questions? Access to textbooks, literature, art supplies. Have they had that experience in their home countries? Teachers, counselors, and administrators who are engaging and supportive, were they present in their lives before coming to American schools? An in-depth presentation of subject matter, access to a wide range of activities. So, for tips for administrators and teachers, this quote is very important to note. I want the refugee students in my building to know that they are contributing to our school, not just adapting to it. The biggest concerns we have observed with refugee students in our schools are personal hygiene, purchasing lunch, appropriate clothing that fits them, that's clean, use of restrooms, finding classrooms. Tackle these issues immediately, and you will see refugee children relax and begin to enjoy themselves in your school. It may take a while for some refugee students to grasp the concept of time. Many have never experienced schedules, clocks, and required school attendance. Review expectations with families and students, but understand that it will take a few weeks for routines to be established. And it's extremely important to set up routines for them. It is not advisable to ask refugee students, of course, about their past history. They may be grieving or experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Help them concentrate on their new school activities and making new friends. BRICS is a valuable organization that offers information for empowering immigrant children and their families. It seeks to strengthen the capacity of refugee serving and mainstream organizations across the United States to empower and ensure the successful development of refugee children, youth, and their families. I highly suggest that you visit this website. Students with limited or interrupted formal education, otherwise known as SLIFEs, are, and I hate that term, it sounds awful. These students are newcomers with 2 or more years of education interrupted in their native country, or they have attended school in the United States, returned to their native country for several years, receiving limited formal education, and then returned to the United States. The challenge isn't simply a question of teaching students with interrupted schooling how to read or speak English. These are students who may also experience a high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, struggle with cultural adjustment or identity issues, and need intensive literacy and content instruction, as well as introduction to the basics of the American school and classroom culture. Here are some characteristics of long-term ELLs, who we have mentioned earlier, those who have been in the LIEP for more than 5 years. So some of these characteristics could include strong oral English skills, or weak English reading and writing skills, weak native language literacy skills, students who are dually identified, poor grades, grade retention, at risk for dropping out, chronic absenteeism, low personal expectations, unassuming or exhibiting challenging behaviors. So these are some factors that may lead to that LTEL status. And I'm not going to read all of them to you, but it's very important to note that these are we really need to focus on these when we make instructional decisions and decisions that may lead to psychological testing.
Transnational.
Okay.
Later on.
Later, Anna will focus on transnationalism. If you would like to know more about refugees, students with limited or interrupted formal education, or long-term ELLs, you can access archived webinars on the Patent website. According to the research, there are 4 main myths about student attendance, and here they are. Missing a few days of school each year is normal and doesn't matter that much. We don't need to worry about attendance until middle or high school. Most schools already monitor student absences. Because families are ultimately responsible for children getting to school, there's not much schools can do to improve attendance. While we need to be cognizant of these myths and misconceptions about this topic. Student mobility is a real challenge for immigrant populations. It refers to students changing schools during a school year. It may be voluntary, such as students changing schools to participate in a new program that may not be available at the home school. Or it may be involuntary, such as the family moving out of the geographical area of the school, possibly for economic reasons, public assistance, housing. I've seen students who have had to move because of homelessness. And we need to understand what the reasons are for the student mobility. So students with high mobility are more likely to drop out of school and to score significantly lower than their peers in standardized assessments. Students with high mobility tend to have behavior challenges, having to constantly adapt to a new environment and new classmates. High mobility may be a cause for the way the student can access their education, and it will have an influence over their learning. These are times of high transition for students. For example, kindergarten into first grade, elementary into middle. It's important that we communicate from one part of the one period to the next. So we need to be in communication from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school. This is all part of collaboration. Collaborative efforts during these transitional times are highly important. Transition shock is an umbrella term that comprises culture shock, chronic distress, traumatic upset, and post-traumatic stress disorder. It can impact student success in a number of behavioral, emotional, and physiological ways. It can also impair the student's ability to acquire and make sense of a language, meaning that it creates unique challenges for America's ELLs, English learners, our fastest growing student population, especially for those students who have come from areas experiencing war or large-scale resettlement. Again, before considering referral for special education services, we must develop an understanding of the ecology of each student. Here we're going to compare acculturation and assimilation. Acculturation is a process through which a person or group from one culture comes to adopt practices and values of another culture, while still retaining their own distinct culture. And that is the important point. That is key, while still retaining their own distinct culture. So it's a two-way process of cultural exchange. I call it a two-way street. Assimilation is the process by which a person or group adopts a new culture that virtually, and key here is replaces their original culture, leaving only trace elements behind at most. And that is largely a one-way process or a one-way street. So acculturation is far more beneficial to immigrant students than the outdated aspect of assimilation. a process during which immigrants fully adopt their new cultures and shed the old. In order for them to develop appropriate psychological and social outcomes, they need to keep the bilingual and bicultural heritage. The practice of encouraging students to talk about and stay connected with their positive memories of their home country is an example of additive acculturation. Young immigrants may have endured difficult journeys out of violence or deprivation into a completely different, shockingly different, and confusing and possibly stressful culture. Many cope with competing pressures to conform to the adopted culture and to live accordingly to their heritage. Even the simplest interactions may be confusing to them or filled with tension and anxiety. Students are often bullied and pushed into distancing themselves from their heritage and culture. The loss that the English learners who experience a cultural bereavement can be exacerbated if family members have not been through the same assimilation experience or acculturation experience, and thus don't share the student's sense of loss. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to reintroduce Anna.
Thank you, Paula. Very important topics, acculturation and assimilation. I have to let you know that through all of the research that we have done in relation to acculturation and assimilation, most of the authors that wrote about assimilation, doing my, going a little deeper, most of them having gone through the experience. They wrote about it, but they have never had to assimilate to any culture. So sometimes the whole idea that it's easy to just sort of like take away one culture and put the other culture in place, it doesn't happen after at least 4 generations. So when you have children who are immigrants who just came here, they will not actually leave that culture and adopt, completely assimilate into the new culture. It will actually take more than that generation to do it. They will be able to function well if they learn the language, but they will still have that identity with their cultures, which is healthy. It is not something that is negative, as some people have really, considered that. And if you will look at historical data, all cultures who immigrated here, it took them 3 to 4 generations to really be considered fully assimilated into the American culture. You would have seen probably, people that would say that their grandparents really assimilated so easily, but they are far away from that experience. Their grandparents probably attended churches where, most of the people were from their same culture, and therefore they maintained that area, probably celebrated holidays or ate ethnic food and talk about the old country when they were in groups. So that is also considered, part of the transition. Then the second generation maybe will still sort of do all the holidays and the food, and then the third generation will be less. So that's how we have sometimes people who are fourth generation talking about things that they really haven't experienced and thinking that it was a very simple way of assimilating. So that's why we bring this up, because it is important that you understand, as counselors, as psychologists, that there is a culture shock. There is a questioning about who am I when you move to another culture, when you come from a country, and then all of a sudden you're in a new country, and then you question your identity. And that is because the message is that you have to really embrace everything that is here and forget who you are. It's not that easy. It is a process, and we need to understand that it doesn't happen in one generation. Okay, so that's important. Those conversations sometimes are so important to have as counselors and psychologists with children who are going through this, crisis. It's very hard. It's very hard because you adopt a different identity. Once you move here, you're not the same person who lived over there, years ago. I can attest to that from experience. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm originally from Lima, Peru. And when I immigrated here, I was already, a teacher. I just graduated from college there, and I came here to further my studies. And I would say that, once I lived here, I was not the same person that left. So that's how your identity really starts to, adapt and change. I also said something about transnationalism. That was on the list that Paula presented on certain characteristics of our new ELs here now. They are transnational because they travel a lot. Like, they are living here maybe for first, second, and third grade, and then they go back to maybe the Dominican Republic or other countries, and then after 2 years they come back, or they frequently travel to stay a month or so during the summer. So that's the transnational generation. So you see, these children who go back to their countries, they also have a different experience from, let's say, refugees who know that they're going to live here, and there's very little, a remote possibility that maybe one day they're going to go back to their countries. Okay, so that is a different way of looking at that acculturation process. It's extended for them because they are going back to their country and then coming back here, going back and then coming back. So they are very much examples of that transnationalism that we see that, takes a toll sometimes. All right, so next steps. Sustained, committed, and professional development is important, especially if we are going to provide these children with some direction when we sit down with them and talk to them as counselors or psychologists. We need to establish some inclusive instructional practices. Even acknowledging that these children are in the schools helps them really negotiate who they are and what value they bring to the table. I walk into some schools that I know that are very diverse, but there's nothing there that will tell me that they actually have students from Myanmar, that they actually have students who are from Colombia or from Ecuador or from Puerto Rico. So that inclusive environment and practices that we need to have in schools are very important for these children to actually develop those strong ties to the new culture. All right. So not acknowledging them as immigrants, as children who come from other countries, does not help them to acculturate. Actually, you need to acknowledge that so they can actually start the process. Fully integrating and recognizing the assets of ELs. That's again, and their families. You need to recognize that you have a resource there. If you have students who come from Myanmar, for example, where is Myanmar? Just, even bringing a map and showing them on a map to all children, hey, these two children, they come from here. Look how far they're coming from. Those are the kinds of things that sometimes we do not see happening in school. And again, that's important for a healthy process of acculturation. The first step is acknowledging that you come here bearing gifts. There's value in your language. There's value in the way that you do things. There's value in the way you interact with others. There's value in your life experience. Then you start, from that step, that foundation, then you start reaching out and learning new ways of doing things. And these children, all of their lives as children, have to really manage or interact or live in two cultures. There's no question about it. They live in the culture of the school when they are in the school, but when they go back home, they live with their communities in a different culture. So that is a good way to navigate that, is making them feel good about what they are bringing with them. For counseling services, for our school counselors, definitely you need to gather more information about families and their experiences. We cannot assume certain things. We cannot assume also the other way around, that they might be families that are second or third generation. Maybe the parents were born here already. So, assumptions are not good when you are going to counsel children. Encourage families to participate in school leadership. Parental engagement is very important for all parents, even for the ones that are new to this country. Actually, it's very important for them because that's the only way they are going to learn how to navigate our school system. So I don't see that outreach, from the perspective of helping them be part of committees, be part of a group of volunteers, or be part of some of the committees to celebrate something. That's important. It's important that we start reaching out. The fact that they don't speak English doesn't mean that they cannot actually participate in certain activities. The ESL teacher must be part of the team discussion for all the discussions about ELs. ESL teachers, as Paula said before, they are really very good at providing you with more information about the children, because they tend to talk about themselves more to the ESL teacher than they do to other teachers. Maybe because they meet in smaller groups, gives them that sense that they can talk to their teachers more. We definitely would like to recommend, the development of cultural brokers. Cultural brokers actually are members of these families for whom, that can or are able to communicate in English more than others. So they are the ones that will help you actually understand certain things about new cultures that move into your school. Cultural brokers really in research-based practices are so important, because you may have some questions about why some things are happening with these children that might be very strange for us. But if you have somebody that you can call and ask about, what is happening, then maybe you will be able to get a good answer, or, actually understand what is going on with those children. So sometimes cultural brokers could be families who have lived in this country longer than the others. Other times, community-based organizations that cater to these cultures are also cultural brokers. Sometimes you need to contact them and try to really help them negotiate the new culture. Migrant education, the migrant education program has wonderful people that will help you with parents. They are very good at hiring these cultural brokers that can help you negotiate part of the cultural innuendos that you might not be able to understand, especially when you're a psychologist or a counselor. Again, the last bullet there, bilingual counselors or social workers who are experts on immigrant students can also train others. Sometimes we have, even if it is not a counselor or a social worker, we might have these teacher assistants or support personnel in the school that will be able to help us negotiate some understanding about these cultures. The possible hidden stressors that you may have with these children and sometimes even their families will be definitely, in some instances, when you are a minority among a minority, it's hard. For example, religious traditions of minority children. When you are Muslim, you are a minority within a minority. Maybe you have certain practices in your religion that are very different than the practices of other EL's religions. So, the way you dress, the way that you contemplate certain, fasting issues, so adjusting is hard for all ELs, but it will be more for ELs that are not usually represented in large numbers in your schools. Okay, so think about that. Navigating a larger school than they used to. Some of our high schools are huge, and some of the schedules and the time that you have to go from one place to the other could be really very stressful for your ELs or for your new immigrants. For parents, learning a different grading system is pretty hard. I have never seen anybody getting all of these EL parents together to explain the grading system. So they don't even know what they represent, and therefore they cannot act upon it. So we expect these parents to actually know everything. But think about that. If you move all of a sudden to Thailand, okay, and you don't speak Thai, and you don't know how to navigate that school system, and you will receive a report card from that school, what would you know about what your child is doing in school, or how well or not well he or she is doing in school? So learning how to interpret report cards is important for all parents. Whether you speak English or not, somebody needs to be doing something about that. Okay. Homework and also the pace of teaching could be very foreign for many of our families. Please have some sort of a welcoming night or time when you really get together with these parents and explain that. Behavior norms could be different. And the last bullet lately has caused a lot of grief among our students and parents, and that is the uncertainty of being undocumented or having an undocumented family member. It's a reality that we live here in the United States now, where, even ICE has been contacted to come to the high schools and take the children away. Some of our colleagues took upon themselves to actually work for ICE part-time, I guess, but not really, I'm saying this as a fastidious way. Not really, but they actually took upon themselves to call ICE and report on these children who were in their high schools, which is, so cruel, but it is happening. Kids know it is happening and they are afraid. Even the little ones now cry a lot because they think that if their parents come to pick them up, maybe one day they won't be there. Or they have been rounded up at dismissal time in elementary schools and take them away. So we are living in times where we are, there's an extra stressor among our students. And we need to recognize that. We cannot just close our eyes and saying it's not happening, because it is happening. So these are some of the hidden stressors that as counselors and psychologists, we know that might be happening in some urban areas, and not so many, urban areas. In many places, this is happening. Paula did a little research about this acculturation and immigrant children implications for educators. You can actually visit this website and find this wonderful information where you're going to really go deeper into the acculturation process by gender, by socioeconomic status, by family attitudes and behaviors, and so forth. This is a good place to go when you want to actually get in-depth information about what is going on with the acculturation process. It will be important for us who work with families, who work with children who are immigrants, to understand that process, because you haven't gone through these processes. I mean, you have lived here all of your life, or maybe if you have traveled, you have gone, or maybe if you, for a job, you have gone to another country, then you know what acculturation is. But if most of our educators really haven't gone through this process, so it is important that as psychologists and as counselors and as teachers, we really understand what is this process. Best practices. The National Association of School Psychologists is wonderful because they are an advocate. They are advocating for psychologists to understand that these are definitely best practices, that there is a prevention area where you have to gather your data, know who these kids are, and what can you do to prevent these anomalies, right? These behavior issues. Your assessment also needs to be aligned to those needs. The consultation, the intervention, and your advocacy is important. It's important for these families, and it's important how do you really collaborate to get the best out of your profession to support these children, all children, including your ELs who need those kinds of supports. When they talk about assessment and collaboration is important when we are going to assess children. It says here that collaboration among school, family, and community stakeholders will help improve evaluation practices and may assist in reducing potential discriminatory assessment practices and inappropriate intervention of test results. So very clearly, we have to gather more than just those test results, those scores. We need to go above and beyond interviewing parents, interviewing the school community, asking for more light in relation to what is going on with this child, not just using, test scores. The idea of the bilingual psychologist that comes always back, sometimes to haunt us, because it is really, whenever I get a phone call asking me to give them a list of all of the bilingual psychologists and what languages can they offer their services, I always have to say, okay, let's do a step back. Who is the child that you would like to use this psychology? How long he has lived in this country? What kind of, why do you think a bilingual psychologist is the only one that can give you, feedback about the exceptionality of the child, whether he or she has an exceptionality? And in many instances, the child was either born here and has a last name like mine, or another issue is the child came here in kindergarten. Now he is in 5th grade, has never been taught in Spanish since he was in kindergarten. He has been in our system. And they want to look for a bilingual psychologist and a bilingual test, or a test in Spanish, right? So in those cases, my input is to really look deeper whether a bilingual psychologist actually is not only a language match, but also the bilingual psychologist knows about the process of second language acquisition, knows about, the power of collecting other data, knows about other issues in relation to assessing the child or evaluating the child. So, like they say, Ochoa, Flanagan, and a lot of researchers say, simple language match will not give you what you're looking for, okay? So before you really look for the bilingual psychologist, look at who is the child you want to evaluate and whether that child actually, if you have lived here for more than 2 years, your language skills, which most IQs are based on that linguistic ability, really are not, they are at least 3 grades below. So forget about the test, they are already 3 grades below in Spanish. So, that gives you a hint. Don't use that test if that is the case. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that valid and reliable ways of doing things need to be reassessed. There's the systemic intervention and advocacy, again, from NASP, and how they really recommend MTSS. Why MTSS? Why really looking at opportunities for children to learn? Catch them at different, use that safety net for these children that need that special intervention that might just be a different way of learning something rather than a disability. So there is a way to really look at also culturally responsiveness or culturally responsive practices attached to that idea that we need to consider the student's entire school experience and not just, okay, there's a teacher who is who wants this child to be evaluated. Let's look at the whole big picture, the ecology of the child. And that is, very important for us. And we appreciate that NASP is also giving us that pointer. Prevention and interventions, definitely. I really think that looking at your programs, looking at what kind of program your child is experiencing from the perspective of language development. This really supports the whole idea of using evidence-based instruction. And also, I always tell psychologists when they call me, I said, have you shadowed this student? Can you actually attest that this student is experiencing an effective program, an effective English development program, and that the teachers, when this child goes back to the classroom, are using some of the accommodations necessary for that child to learn? Because if that is not happening, then there's a huge question mark about whether it is really a disability. Because in many instances, that is the case. We have many ELs in receiving special education practices that I am sure shouldn't be there. And we need to stop doing that. Family school collaboration is also very important. NASP has pointed out in 2010 that we need to actually look at what is going on with this child when the child is back, at home. Are we getting some feedback from parents? We have to really understand that children, the child's world is not only the school. So we need to touch upon other areas to get a better picture of whether, the child really has a disability or not. Okay, so those interactions with parents and with the family and even sometimes with the community are very important. Collaboration, again, that part of that advocacy is so important for all of us to understand that there is a way to really create bridges rather than exclude parents just because they don't speak English. In many instances, that is used as an excuse. Well, what do you want me to do? I don't speak Vietnamese. The fact that you don't speak Vietnamese doesn't mean that you have to exclude that family from the school environment and from the services that they have the right to receive. That's part of when I look at social justice. They are individual rights that these parents and these children have. Access to education is a civil right. So if we are limiting that access, and on top of that, we are, somehow identifying children, we are not providing access, and then we identify them as needing special education, that really is not in line with what we need to do with children who are immigrants or children who speak other languages. Definitely, SEAs and LEAs have an obligation to actually support parents' communication with the schools. So if there's not a system in place, we have to have it. And it's not about like the parents need to bring somebody to translate for them. We need to be providing those services. It is our obligation to do that. In the toolkit, OELA's toolkit that I have referred to in webinar 2, definitely you can find a lot of ways of identifying an appropriate and competent translator or interpreter. In many instances, I know that psychologists sometimes rely on competent translators, but make sure that it's the competent translator, that really the translator can actually understand well the seriousness of using their services to maybe provide feedback about assessments. Okay, so make sure that there is competence. And again, successful communication with parents is part of a requirement for an IEP meeting. Parents need to know what you're going to be doing with their child and agree on that. It's a contract that they sign with you about their the IEP of their children. So there has to be extra care when you have an interpreter doing that part of the communication with parents. I think that we have gone, we have for IEP translators, we have gone to a different level now. So there is a lot of other tools. There's documents translated into different languages. And that is good because we need to provide that to parents. One piece that we have always been advocating is that, yes, we do have an overrepresentation of ELs in special education in the learning disabled group, but we have a very low number of ELs identified for gifted and talented. So that is something that we need to start thinking about, because I know that, at some point, this needs to be addressed from the Bureau of Special Education and also from PDE. It's, these are just the latest numbers that we got. Only 2% of ELs are enrolled in gifted and talented programs as compared to 7% of non-ELs. Okay, so historically, there is an underrepresentation of students from culturally and linguistically diverse communities in gifted and talented programs. And that is across the board, and it's something that the Office for Civil Rights are really looking into. Here is a chart that, you can actually go deeper into this chart. We have this as a resource that you can go and find more information. 4 phases for improving identification of ELs for gifted and talented: the pre-identification, the preparation, the identification, and the acceptance of placement. All of that really calls for more culturally and linguistically diverse way of looking at these children. That is so very important for all of us to consider. The web of communication, we thought it was something we would like to share with you, so you can go into this resource and find how you're going to be more effective when you start, not only finding these children, assessing them, and then how do you communicate through the system and to parents, and how do you support them to be successful once they are identified. So in conclusion, or to conclude our 3 webinars here, before referral, please consider a systematic process for examining the specific background variables or ecologies of ELs that impact academic achievement in our classrooms. We have a list there that we have, really touched upon. First and second language proficiency, that's important. Talk to the ESL teacher, shadow the student to see how well he's doing that. What are some of the histories about, the way that they have implemented these programs? Is the child somebody that comes from a rural experience or an urban experience in their countries? Has he had interrupted education? What immigration pattern do they have? Have they lived in this area for, all of their lives? Or maybe they just moved from one area to the other. Their socioeconomic status, and very, very important, their culture. We have talked about that. Before referral, consider examination of the appropriateness of classroom instruction and the classroom context based on knowledge of individual students' factors. Is there really, or are there opportunities to learn for these children? Are these programs, the language programs, really implemented appropriately? Is the child getting ESL or ELD instruction daily? It is a requirement. It is in the back. You have to teach ESL daily. So it is not 10 minutes or 15 minutes 3 times a week, daily. All right? Because that's how he will acquire enough English to be able to perform. If no English instruction is happening, I assure you that that child will be in special ed in 2 more years. That's for sure. Okay. And how do ESL and content teachers collaborate in instruction? Is there collaboration for grading decisions? How does the administration make sure this is happening? Is there an oversight from the administration? So it's not left for the ESL teacher to fend for herself or himself. There is a collaborative effort with the leadership, that if you walk into a school and you talk to the principal about ELs, the principal will be able to say, yes, we have actually, X number of ELs, and this is how they are taken care of. Before referral, please consider information gathered through informal and formal assessments. Look at their language development assessments. Look at access scores. Compare them to the last 2 years. Look at everything related to language development. Talk to the ESL teacher. Ask her to give you input about, her classroom assessments. If he's learning and he's progressing in the classroom with ESL in language development, then there is not such a great, inclination to say he cannot learn because he has a disability. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that you need to be looking at. And then are the PA English Development Standards and WIDA performance definitions used to develop instruction and assessment for ELs. Before referral, please consider non-discriminatory interpretation of all assessment data. That is so important. Is student progress monitored in all areas of instruction, including ESL, ELD instruction? Are supports, interventions, and accommodations included when setting rigorous goals to meet grade level standards? Is there growth in language acquisition? Are you comparing them to, true peers? Are most teachers in the data team aware about second language acquisition? Is the ESL teacher participating in these meetings? With that, we are closing our third webinar. Thank you. This is our code for today's webinar. The code word is ESSA. That's the address for the Survey Monkey. I will keep it there for 1 minute so you can copy it. We have been very glad to see that we have had, several participants. If you know of any colleagues that you think would benefit from this, let them know that we will be archiving these webinars, and that if they have any questions, if they would like more elaboration on any of these ideas, you're welcome to email the address that you have at the end, or you can also email Marcy. Marcy usually will give us, the questions so we can answer. So we're very glad that, we had participants that are going to benefit from this information. We will have the survey available through October 18th. It will be open until 4 p.m. Resources, we have, copious resources. We research a lot of very current information. So we invite you to go deeper into these resources. They're very good places to go. We also invite you to actually go into the some of the government documents that we have had, our standards, the Bureau of Special Education here, the PD Bureau of Special Education. We have some guidelines there that you can download for students with IEPs, ELs with IEPs. OELA, please get that manual. It's very good, that kit. Get into our pattern website. It's important. We have a whole piece there.
Saying what the survey is closed, we'll take care of that right away.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying that the survey is closed and we'll take care of that right away.
Okay, we will, if the survey is closed right now, Marcy, yeah, go, okay.
We'll take care of it right away.
We will take care of this right away if the survey is closed. Maybe, somebody forgot to push a button there. So we will do that right away, okay? like I was telling you before, please visit our website. We have copious resources. Don't forget to go to that WIDA page. That's important too. Okay, if you want to look at those manuals that we have about assessments. If you have another question, please contact Dr. Victor Rodriguez Diaz, who is the Assistant Director here at Patton, or you can always email Marcy Davis. You have her email at the beginning of this webinar. She's the one that is probably going to push that button to open the SurveyMonkey. Thank you very much again. And have a dry day. My goodness, it's still raining horribly here in Harrisburg. So have a nice day and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.